Welcome to the Dreamit Dose. Frequently, we hear founders talk about pivoting. They struggle with when, where, and how they should pivot. Most technical founders only think about pivoting on product features. That's only one way of at least a dozen ways to pivot. Let's dive in. Dreamit Ventures has been investing in great early-stage startups for over a decade. The Dreamit Dose allows us to share best practices to help even more founders. Tell us about your great startup using the links below. First, let's talk about when. When should you pivot? There's a simple two-part test to help figure this out. Number one, are you happy with your traction or are you significantly underperforming? If you're underperforming, move on to number two, which is, do you have enough runway left to execute a pivot? Whether your startup is venture-backed or self-funded, make sure you pivot while you still have plenty of time. That way you can try new things, run experiments, and prove that something new is working before the music stops. This is particularly important if you need to pitch investors for new money. You have to have enough evidence that the pivot is working. So that's when. Let's start getting into where and how. First, a trap. We see technical and product-focused founders that get tunnel vision and only want to pivot on the product itself. We don't have traction, so it's obvious that we haven't built the right product. So let's keep adding or changing features until we get it right. This is myopic and may be wrong. For a startup to get traction, it takes more than just product. If you haven't watched our dose on how to be clever on more than one axis, make sure to check it out. The point I make in that dose is there are multiple axes or ways that a startup can be clever, aka there are numerous ways founders can pivot to find success. Now there's one more thing we should talk about before getting into the actual points where you can pivot. I want to touch on micro pivots versus macro pivots. A micro pivot is a small adjustment, for example, to your marketing campaigns, product features, or something small about your pricing. Then there are huge macro pivots. For example, changing from B2C to B2B, changing from a direct to channel sales strategy, or we've seen this, a complete shutdown of the company and reincarnation into something completely different. Just keep in mind that when you do huge macro pivots, you better have plenty of runway, aka cash, as pulling off a huge pivot takes a lot of time to execute and see if you get traction. A quick story. At Dreamit Ventures in 2009, I got to witness an amazing massive pivot. Jack and Russ came into Dreamit and were working on a company, Scribnia. I challenged them to think about the two most critical assumptions that if wrong, they were dead. For weeks, they tried to de-risk those critical assumptions. In the end, they felt that their two assumptions were incorrect. They did a complete 180 and totally changed their focus, company, and product. They took on a new name, SeatGeek, and 10 years later, they're a leader in the primary and secondary online ticketing markets and are even taking deals away from Ticketmaster. Okay, it's finally time for some specifics on where you can pivot. One of the most important things you should think about pivoting on is the problem itself. Study after study shows that over 50% of startups fail because they're not solving a big and urgent problem customers are having. Are you really solving a big and urgent problem? Is it a top 3 problem for your target customer or user? If not, people usually don't care enough to do something about it. And if you decide to pivot on the problem, make sure to speak with a wide array of people to confirm that this time you're picking something truly painful and urgent. The next area you can think about is pivoting on your solution. So your target users and customers did confirm you're working on a really big and urgent problem, but is your solution actually solving the problem in a unique way and in a manner that your customers care about? Realize it's not enough to just solve the problem. You have to solve it in a way that customers will care about deeply. Think about it this way. Is your solution a nice to have, a need to have, or a must have? You want it to be a must have, so customers and users adopt it like crazy. Okay, you've identified a great problem and you have a unique solution for it. The next thing you should confirm is if you're focused on the right customer. Let's say you're HP and in the early days, you made an oscilloscope that shows a waveform. You could sell it to a car mechanic to help them check a car's timing, or you could sell it to a cardiologist to tell if someone is dying of a heart attack. The car mechanic may give you a meh about your solution and say, there's a lot of ways to solve that problem. Why do I need this? But the cardiologist says to you, oh my God, that's amazing. You're going to immediately help me save more lives. I've never seen anything like this. So do you see the difference? The mechanic and cardiologist both have a problem that your solution addresses, but the mechanic has many ways to solve the problem and the cardiologist does not. So the problem and solution you came up with were fine. You were just focused on the wrong customer. Okay, let's say you've got the right problem, a unique solution, and you're going after the right customer. The next area you could pivot on is your pricing model. What's your customers or users' willingness to pay, or WTP? Perhaps your pricing is off and you need to pivot on that. Or maybe it's how you price that's the issue. For example, annual contracts versus monthly fee versus a single lump sum. Or perhaps you need to use a freemium model. And if you do, just make sure there's enough meum. Or should you consider a success fee or risk-sharing based revenue model where you don't get paid unless it works or depending on how well it works? There are so many ways to think about pricing, and perhaps that's where you need to pivot. Moving on, maybe your pricing is okay, but the issue you need to pivot on is marketing. For example, your cost of customer acquisition, CAC, or long-term value, LTV. Perhaps you're running Google AdWords, Facebook ads, or Apple search ads, and you're spending tens of thousands of dollars per month trying to acquire users, and it's just not working. So you've been generating $5,000 per month in revenue for the last 6 months, but spending $12,000 per month in online marketing. AKA your acquisition costs are hideously expensive compared to your revenue. That's a problem. So maybe it's your marketing where you need to pivot. But wait, there's more. Those are just some of the larger areas where you can pivot. I want you to start thinking about other axes in your business where you can pivot. Maybe it's your sales strategy, maybe it's distribution, maybe it's the way you're positioning, or something else. As you think about pivoting using what I've discussed above or around some other aspect of your business, I want you to make sure you're thinking critically about why you should pivot and around what particular point. Why do you think pivoting there will be successful? Okay, that's it. That's how you know when to pivot and a lot of ways for how you can pivot. First, think about when you should pivot. Plenty of runway left and not meeting goals. Second, don't just pivot on your product. Third, make sure you're solving a big and urgent problem. Fourth, maybe you should pivot on the solution and its uniqueness. Fifth, think about pivoting on your target customer. Sixth, look closely at your pricing. 7, perhaps you have to pivot on your marketing strategy. And finally, number 8, there are myriad issues you can attack when pivoting. Make sure you're thinking critically. That's it. That's your Dreamit Dose. Please leave your questions in the comments section. If you found this video valuable, please like and subscribe. We have a lot more coming. To see all of our doses, go to dreamit.com/dose. See you next time. But wait, there's more. Hold on. Now there's one more thing we should talk about before getting into the actual points where you can, think about it this way. Is your solution a nice to have? You don't get paid unless it works depending on blah, 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 blah.